you're constantly tinkering, right? You're constantly thinking about how can I do new things? How can I find efficiencies in my business? And I think this is a big one I think some people overlook is you're willing to kind of roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty with this, because the mistake I see for a lot of brokers out there is they just say, can someone just set this up for me? I don't want to spend the time. I don't want to do it. I just need someone to go. And there are consultants out there that will do that, and it's nothing against them or anything. But what I see time and time again is someone will go down that path. They'll hire someone will come and set up all these crazy flows for them. Then maybe something changes in your process, right? Maybe you choose, instead of a Calendly tool, you use Microsoft Teams, which Teams now has to book those things. Well, now you got to call that consultant, and now that consultant is now maybe moved to Costa Rica with all the money they made. I don't know, but that's a reality, right? And now you're kind of stuck, and all that money invested is no longer worth it. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Mortgage Tech Talks. This week, I'm going to be talking about workflow/automation tools. So it's a question I get all the time. Something like a Zapier, that's the most common one, if you know that one. But basically, these are tools that connect to different systems and automate repetitive tasks for you. So the promise of them are very, very exciting. And if you can nail it, it is exciting. But what I'm going to do in this episode is I'm going to say, well, again, kind of break down exactly what are these tools, what are your different options and pros and cons of each of them, because it's not just Zapier, so it's good to know that. And then finally, the big question, do I actually go out and buy one of these tools and implement it for my mortgage business? Is it worth it? We walk through all of that, kind of the checklist you need to go through yourself. So if this is interesting to you, we're going to break that all down and we'll see you on the other side. Okay, let's get right into it here. So to start off, I think we should level set a little bit. I did an episode like this a few weeks ago on e-sign, and this kind of intro wasn't so necessary because everyone knows what e-sign is, and that's fine. These ones are a little less known, so I really want to kind of just at least break down exactly what they are. So as we go in through evaluating these different types of tools, we know what we're talking about. So, basically what are these workflow automation tools? Basically what they are more than anything is that they enable integrations, two different seemingly maybe unconnected systems to be able to interact with each other. So that's the concept. We want to be able to say, hey, this thing over here that I'm using, whatever it might be, I want it to be able to talk with this other thing here, right? And usually the form that it takes, I think almost always the form that it takes, is that there is a trigger. So something happens, right? Maybe it's, the same time every day at 4 a.m. every day, that's my trigger, or an event happens, right? So maybe, in the case of, that I'll show you in a second, like a new event gets created. So a new event gets created over here, and then I get a reaction over here in this other piece of software. So that's the point of these tools, is to have these different systems talk to each other. So that's the idea. How you get there, this is the cool part, is, normally if you want to do that, you'd have to, write some APIs and get a developer and do all these different things. It's all drag and drop, right? So that's really the value of these tools is, yes, two different systems can talk together. That's not a new concept really, but before, you would need to go out, hire someone, figure out authentications, which is basically the handshake that gives permissions to actually interact. And then, host it on a server somewhere, run that code on the server. There's 100 steps to that. This is, hey, ready to go. All I need to do is just drag and drop and get it going. So the example that I'll give, I was kind of briefly alluding to it, but I'll share it on my screen, I think is a good one. Calendly event getting created. So for anyone who doesn't know Calendly, the idea is, you send a link to your clients, maybe discovery call. They can see your availability, not all your events, but your availability, and can say, hey, I want to talk to Tom at this time. They click it, an event invite goes out to them. It gets stored on your calendar, your Google Calendar, Outlook calendar, whatever you're using. And that's great. This Zapier, so this is in Zapier, which I'll explain what that is in a second, but it's probably the king of these workflow tools, Zapier. They use this example, and I think it illustrates the point well, where, okay, I can use Calendly, and all those things I just described can happen. But what I want to happen also is that when an invitee schedules an event, right? So when that event gets created, that's how they're describing it. I actually want a text message, right? So up until this point, those are two different systems. I don't know how I'd connect that all together. But basically now through Zapier, these workflow tools, we can say, hey, when that happens, that's the trigger.
in Calendly. The reaction is that in Twilio, which is a tool that can be used to send text messages, and there's other ones, but we're going to use Twilio as the example here, it'll see that event gets triggered, a signal gets sent over to Twilio. Twilio can send that text message to you. So, hey, you're out and about, you're at the grocery store, you see your client just booked a meeting with you, maybe you realize, hey, that time actually doesn't work so well. You can quickly, maybe call that person and reschedule. So it allows these integrations that add to your productivity. So that's the intro. And yeah, I think it's super important to kind of get that out there. Another really common example is in my world that I see where I started kind of using Zapier and where I see a lot in the mortgage industry is connecting your deal submission platform. So I know a lot of deal submission platforms out there are, not all of them, but some of them do use something like a Zapier. And the idea is, okay, when someone completes an application, let's say, I want that client to show up in my CRM. Of course, CRM is the world that I live in more. And so when I first started in this industry, I actually used a tool just like this. And that was a great value add that I could bring to the industry because I knew how to use these tools. And that concept of saying, hey, when an app's created, I want them to show up in my list so I can market to them later. It's really valuable. It's still very valuable. But at first, at least, we started it with Zapier and these types of tools. Now we've graduated to code because it just gives us that much more scale and affordability and all these different things. That's where we started. And so really the question that I want to kind of answer in this is, first of all, what are your different options? Okay, what are the different tools out there? I've talked a lot about Zapier, but there are other ones, and I'll go through each of those. And then really, do you need it for your mortgage business, right? So we're going to kind of walk through those two questions there. Do I really need it, or could I just use, a provider like Blue Mortgage just to do all those hookups for me? Short answer is we don't do that, but maybe there's other providers out there that can do that. How should I think about it? So let's get into it. I've talked about Zapier a bunch. Reason being, they're kind of like the DocuSign, right? In the e-sign version, they're kind of the king. They're the ones that almost invented the category, I would say. They're kind of the first movers. They have a massive advantage. And, I think that's great. And I think they've been able to secure their position as kind of that leader two different ways. One, they've really, really focused on making it so simple. And I think that's great, right? So I think the average, let's just call it business owner out there, just user, anybody who might be interested in this, they're not developers, because if they were a developer, they go out and do all those things that I described, right? Write it themselves and do APIs and all this crazy stuff. So they didn't say, hey, I want to focus. I don't want to really worry about, I guess, that developer side of things so much. I want to focus on that everyday person, that business owner who just needs a couple things together. So super simple, very clean UI. I think they've done a great job. They've really made it simple and intuitive how you kind of set these different flows up. And the other thing that, I guess just comes with it is they have a lot of integrations, right? As we talk about these different tools talking to each other, and such an important part of that is, having it in their library, right? Because how these tools work, just so without kind of doing a full tutorial, they have a library, right? That you can't just connect to anything. You can't build an app today and then all of a sudden it shows up in these tools. You have to be able to connect them to the ecosystem, right? And so they have a huge ecosystem, huge marketplace, tons and tons of tools if you are going to build into one of these softwares. So if, again, I come out tomorrow with a brand new app and I want someone to be able to use a workflow tool with my app, the first one I'm going to go to is Zapier, right? So it has this almost network effect. I guess, what would you call it? A network effect, a competitive advantage that allows them to kind of continue to separate themselves from the competition. So that's a great thing about them. And the only kind of downside, and you hear about this a lot actually with Zapier and how they work, is they do have very confusing pricing. I'm not going to try and break it down here because it would take maybe 5 minutes. But yeah, basically, you have to kind of go through and really decipher what are you using and how does it work, because they charge you based on workflows, right? So that's like a pre-existing setup of two apps together. How many times you use that workflow. So in the Calendly example, how many events are going through on a given day, how many text messages you're receiving on a given day, what apps you're using. So they have like standard and premium apps. So if I connect to Twilio, maybe that's a premium app. I got to pay extra. And then you got to pay extra for tables and interfaces and chatbots. And yeah, like I said, I don't want to get into all of it. So it's really confusing pricing. I think they know they're the leaders. They know people go there first, and they're really charging a pretty penny for it. But hey, I know a lot of people use this tool and think it's well worth it. So hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. from the perspective of Zapier, simply because, a ton of people still really use this tool. So that's kind of the incumbent, so to speak. That's where people go first. But I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about some of the challengers, so to speak. So the one I've been looking at a little bit recently, which is kind of interesting, is something called N8n. So you can look them up, N8n. They are competing with Zapier, but they're kind of saying, okay, Zapier has this, I guess, niche nailed down of that business owner who just wants something simple and setting it up. We're going to actually focus our tool, even though it's drag and drop, on the developer, actually. So, they kind of went full circle. It's kind of this weird hybrid of, okay, a developer who maybe doesn't want to set up their own server, maybe just doesn't have the money to do it, right? Because to run a server costs money. They instead just want something that's quick and easy to spin up, but still have that flexibility, that capability to really make it their own, which you could do, obviously, when you write custom code. You can do whatever you want. So that's, I think, what they're aiming for. And how I know that, how I can kind of see that is, they have concepts like multiple environments, right? They have like a dev environment and a production environment. So you can kind of manage these releases, and it's all through things like GitHub, right? So again, I won't go down there, but these are all very common developer tools. The thing about it is you could even self-host this, right? So if you didn't have that money, you don't want to use, whereas you can actually download the software onto your computer and just run it there, which is, you never hear that anymore, but you can do that. So I think that they're trying to go the other way, kind of nail this kind of niche market, and I think they are picking up some steam. So maybe there is something there. It's something I'm paying attention to just because I think it's interesting. There is a little bit more flexibility to it. For me, I think the big thing with something like this is, okay, how much am I saving by using this versus, again, just open up my laptop and starting to code, because you kind of need that coding brain to even use this in the first place. So where's the trade-off? What's the right balance? Tough to say, and I think it's just worth monitoring. This one here, a little bit complicated pricing, maybe not as complicated, but they do charge per workflow, per task, but they start at about $20 a month versus $30 a month is the starting point for Zapier. So a little bit cheaper, a little less complicated, and maybe they're competing on pricing too. The third one is something called Make.com. Used to be, I think, Integromat. This one I'm a little less familiar with. Again, they're trying to find their spot. I think they're trying to find this very narrow gap between Zapier and this N8n. So N8n, okay, maybe a little too developer-y. Zapier, a little too basic, a little too simple. Okay, we're going to find that hybrid. And if you look at it, you can see them. I'll actually maybe share the screen here for those who are following along on YouTube. Let me pull it up here. You can see what it looks like here. I'll scroll down. There's a great example, something like this, right? Where it's all kind of drag and drop, where each one of these different circles here is a different step along the way, and you can have branches and different things like that. So this type of branching exists in like an N8n, not actually Zapier. But the nice visual with dots and polka dots and things like that, that's much more Zapier than it is N8n. So they're trying to find this middle ground, right? And I think again, it's an interesting one to pay attention to. Again, if you need a little bit more capability than something like Zapier, it can help. So it's trying to differentiate on what it serves, but actually I think where it's really differentiating on is pricing, right? They've heard that feedback. Zapier's complicated. Even N8n, it's not super clear. They're super simple. They're like, we just charge, I think it's per task, right? So they have different tiers, how many flows through. I think their base is 10,000 flows a month. So unless you're getting more than 10,000 texts, you're probably okay. And it's like $9 a month, right? So they're, I think, really trying to compete on pricing. And again, for different people, maybe that works. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe they need something a little simpler or something a little bit more complex, because from a usability perspective, again, this Make.com is kind of somewhere in the middle between Zapier and N8n. So that about wraps up those three tools I want to talk about. So you got Zapier, again, first mover, super simple, a little bit complex pricing. N8n, kind of for developers, but not developers who want to fully code it, but still want a tool that helps them kind of drag and drop, but a little bit more control. Make tries to find somewhere in the middle, but a little bit better pricing. So the real question is, okay, in my mortgage business, do I really need this? Now, the short answer is you'll hate this, is it absolutely depends. I think I'd say, call it 80 to 90% of brokers out there, I'd say honestly, probably not. That's just my honest take. Unless, and this is probably the 10 to 20% who I think it does make sense for, unless you're using a lot of different tools, right? So that's one thing. So there's a lot of value in this, right? Because I'm trying to connect a bunch of different things.
you're constantly tinkering, right? You're constantly thinking about how can I do new things? How can I find efficiencies in my business? And I think this is a big one I think some people overlook is you're willing to kind of roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty with this. Because the mistake I see for a lot of brokers out there is they just say, can someone just set this up for me? I don't want to spend the time. I don't want to do it. I just need someone to go. And there are consultants out there that will do that. And it's nothing against them or anything. But what I see time and time again is someone will go down that path. They'll hire someone will come and set up all these crazy flows for them. Then maybe something changes in your process, right? Maybe you choose, instead of a Calendly tool, you use Microsoft Teams, which Teams now has to book those things. Well, now you got to call that consultant, and now that consultant is now maybe moved to Costa Rica with all the money they made. I don't know, but that's a reality, right? And now you're kind of stuck, and all that money invested is no longer worth it. There's a ton of other those types of scenarios. Even the tools themselves change. Maybe you don't change tools, but Calendly says, hey, do you know what, the way we do things, it's going to be slightly different. And so every one of those maybe flows that you've built based on Calendly and the way they used to do things no longer works. So again, you got to get in there and try and figure things out. Are you calling a consultant to do that? Probably not. And even if they aren't in Costa Rica, they're still not going to look at it for 2-3 weeks. It can be a pretty big mess. So what I say is, this is your checklist. If you want to use something like this, I love it. First of all, I love these tools. And if anybody does use them, I think, you're a rock star for using them. It absolutely will save you a lot of time. But I'd say this is your checkbox. 1, you're using a lot of different tools. Talked about that already. So there's value in connecting them. 2, you're obsessed about efficiency, right? Every time you're doing something repetitive or something like that, it bugs you. And so you want to get something a little bit more automated. These tools would be great for that. And 3, you kind of fully understand. You don't have to build it all. Maybe that's a key clarification, but you have to be able to at least understand it, right? Maybe you don't have time to build it all, but if something breaks, you're not having to call that whatever person who built it. You can get in there and do it yourself. So that would be my checklist if someone's considering these types of tools. That about wraps it up for today. I hope this was useful. And this is a very common question that I get from different brokers. So hopefully that kind of breaks it down for you. If you do have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section below. And we'll see you next week.